Welcome to this explainer. We tend to think of the Bronze Age as this thriving, deeply interconnected, totally globalized world. We're talking monumental architecture and sprawling trade routes. But beneath the surface of all those incredible human triumphs, there's a series of deeply unsettling mysteries. We are talking about entire civilizations that just vanished, rulers who were completely erased from time, and strange, physical clues that literally still defy modern explanation today. Let's get right into it. So think about this for a second. What actually happens when an entire kingdom simply vanishes? Imagine bustling centers of commerce, places where elite diplomats negotiated and merchants traded everything from raw copper to exotic animals, just completely dropping off the face of the earth. There are no massive ruins to point at and absolutely zero definitive coordinates to plug into a GPS, just ghosts left behind in the historical record.
It really highlights the ultimate illusion of permanence, doesn't it? When we look at our own modern, super-connected world today, with next-day delivery and global supply chains, we feel incredibly secure. We feel like it's permanent. But the thing is, the Bronze Age felt exactly the same way. It was an era where ships constantly crossed the Mediterranean, packed to the brim with luxury goods, and kings wrote diplomatic letters to one another as total equals. And yet, the earth just swallowed them up. All that's left behind is silent ash, scattered dust, and massive questions that no historian or scientist has fully figured out.
Okay, moving on to Section 1, Lost Empires and Cities. Think about three massive hubs of wealth and power that left behind tangible physical evidence, like diplomatic letters and exotic goods, but literally no definitive GPS coordinates. First up, Tarhun Tassa. Back in the 13th century BC, a Hittite king actually relocated his entire royal court there, making it the literal seat of an empire. Yet, archaeologists are still out there digging through southern Anatolia right now, just trying to find it. Then there's Al-Ashia. This was a kingdom that shipped so much copper it essentially sustained international economies. We see it prominently featured in the famous Amarna letters. And finally, Punt. The Egyptians literally referred to it as God's land. We can actually see the exotic incense trees and stilt houses intricately carved into Pharaoh Hatshepsut's reliefs, but we still can't point to it on a map with total certainty. It's wild.
It has been over 3,000 years since ships sailed from these ports. 3 millennia of complete silence since they carried the lifeblood of ancient economies across the Mediterranean, right before being swallowed by obscurity. Every single piece of pottery we pull from the dirt today is just a tiny, fragile fragment. It shows us exactly how vulnerable an interconnected world really is when the links in the chain begin to break down.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Bronze Age collapse.
Now you have to understand, this wasn't just a single bad year. It was a perfect storm. We're talking about a devastating cascade of interconnected crises that caused a totally globalized Bronze Age supply chain to completely and utterly unravel. The climate shifted. That caused prolonged droughts, which strangled agricultural production, leading straight into famine and then, naturally, political rebellions. Add in the mysterious marauding sea peoples violently attacking the coastlines, and an international structure that relied entirely on complex trade was totally shattered.
Just put yourself in the shoes of an Ugarit scribe documenting the literal end of your world. Ugarit was an incredibly prosperous coastal city, a true crossroads between civilizations. And in its final, chaotic days, this scribe pressed these panicked words into a clay tablet, practically begging for military assistance that was never going to arrive. Enemies are moving, ships have been sighted. When archaeologists eventually found this tablet, it was buried deep in the thick ash layer of the city's ultimate destruction. It's basically a haunting, real-time dispatch from the end of an era.
And the collapse was so total that the powerful Mycenaean Greeks didn't just lose their grand palaces, they completely lost their ability to write. Can you imagine? An entire civilization suffering such severe, widespread trauma that their whole administrative bureaucracy just vanishes. Their script, what we call Linear B, simply stopped being used. For centuries afterward, mainland Greece entered a dark age, and the real, factual history of their mighty, giant-built stone citadels, it warped and morphed into the mythic tales of Homer's epics.
Let's look at Section 3, Messages Carved in Stone. Over at the Ain Dara Temple, which is famously guarded by colossal lions and sphinxes, you'll find massive footprints, over a meter long, cut directly into the floor. Was this meant to symbolize a towering deity physically stepping into the sanctuary right alongside you? We honestly don't know the exact ritual intent. Or
Look at the copper oxide ingots from Cyprus that carry these unique, undeciphered symbols. Were these essentially the Bronze Age equivalent of corporate logos for commercial branding, identifying the quality of a specific shipment? Or were they fragments of a lost communication system that just died with the merchants who used them?
This idea of a liminal space, a boundary between the normal world and the supernatural, is perfectly captured by the elaborate, pitch-black underground chambers the Hittites built right beneath their capital of Hattusa. The Hittite worldview was incredibly complex. It was filled with unseen gods and spirits. So when they carved these carefully constructed stone passages deep into the earth beneath their massive fortifications, they weren't just moving dirt. Were these simply covert escape routes for soldiers during a siege? Or were they thresholds where priests descended into the darkness to perform sacred underground rituals? The stones survived, for sure, but their true meaning is buried in the dark.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 4, Vanishing Royals.
So, science has essentially solved King Tut's death 3 different times now. The boy king took the throne around age 9 and was dead by 18 or 19. Decades ago, X-rays showed bone fragments in his skull, which instantly ignited a dramatic murder theory full of ancient court intrigue. But actually, modern CT scans proved that damage happened way after death. Then, science pivoted to a genetic illness theory, matching physical abnormalities that explain the dozens of walking canes found piled up in his tomb. Today, though, the leading thought is a tragic accident, a massive leg fracture that became fatally infected, combined with a terrible bout of malaria. Even with his body perfectly preserved, the true story of his final days remains painfully out of reach.
Then there's the sudden, highly deliberate erasure of Pharaoh Akhenaten's daughters from the historical record. Akhenaten built a brand new sun-worshipping capital, and his family was depicted in incredibly intimate, almost beautiful artwork. But shortly after his death, his city was totally abandoned and his whole religious revolution was intentionally wiped out by his successors. His daughters disappeared from the monuments entirely. Did they die of a sudden disease? Were they swept up in violent political purges? We don't really know. We only know that Queen Ankhesenamun, who was married to King Tut, found herself completely alone after his death. She actually wrote a desperate letter begging a foreign Hittite king for a husband so she wouldn't have to face her enemies unassisted. The prince was sent, but he was killed on his way to Egypt, and Ankhesenamun simply faded into silence.
Looking at the incredible fragility of the ancient world, how permanent do you think our own society truly is? The people of Hattusa, of Mycenae, and of Ugarit, they walked streets they thought would last for eternity. They wrote letters, they shipped goods, and they loved their families. Yet the sands of time reduced their entire universe to just scattered clues and eerie anomalies. So what fragments of our civilization will actually survive 3,000 years from now? And what mysteries will we become for the archaeologists of the future? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.